When Steiner was growing up, I think it's important to realize that his studies were in science, physics, chemistry, biology. He grounded himself in the university, the Technical University in Vienna in that. But he was also studying literature and philosophy. And at 16, he was studying Kant already. So he then has to look at how do people think, how do they think the world's made, and how do we understand it as a philosopher. And one of the dominant influences at that time was the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who'd written his work at the end of the 18th century. Now that's a huge voluminous work that we can't go into, but two things stand out. That Kant came to the conclusion that human beings cannot really know the world. We have impressions given to us through the senses, but actually what's producing these impressions and what's behind it all, that's unknowable to the human being. So the human being lives in a universe where he's really a bit of a stranger. He can't really say, this is my home, because he doesn't know it, if I can put it like that. And the other thing, he came to the conclusion that one must try to establish in this, if I can put it, uncertain universe, a basis for action. What is good action? And he wanted to find a principle.
This is Kant.
Kant.
Yes.
Wanted to find a principle that one could base one's actions on. And he came to what's called the categorical imperative, which is act, something like this, act in such a way that the principle of your action, through your own will, can become like a universal law of nature. Let me explain. He says, I feel I must act always honestly, because if everybody acts honestly, the world can go on. I feel that I'm entitled to steal or tell lies. If all the world steals or tells lies as a universal principle, society is impossible. So in that would give me a guidance to right action. That's what he felt. Now Steiner rejected both these approaches. First of all, the question of the world being unknowable for him was just a misunderstanding of our relationship to the world. From Steiner's point of view, a human being stands in the world and the world's impressions come through the senses, green, movement, light, warmth, hardness, all that sort of stuff. And that's given to us. We don't do anything about that. I don't create that tree. The tree's all given there. But I, as a human being, also act into it because I bring the concept tree, green, the relationship of that tree, the kind of tree that is related to that another tree, and so on. All that is a human product in relationship to what's given to me. So you have a given world and a world that's the product of human thinking. And these two interacting give us what we call the real world. So it isn't a world we can never know. It's not always immediately known, but it's not in its essence unknowable. Does that make that all clear?
Yeah.
So he rejected that Kantian approach, and for him it then became a question of trying to understand just how do we know the world? That's the science of epistemology. How do we know the world? And then, to understand that, we have to look at, well, what is thinking? Now, of course, philosophers and scientists have been thinking for thousands of years. But for Steiner, the question is, well, they haven't turned their attention to the actual activity itself. They've used thinking as the instrument for understanding the world, but not turned their attention to the nature of that instrument. What is it happening when a human being thinks? Now, there are many views on this today, and especially from neuroscience, we get all sorts of attempts to understanding the thinking process going on in the brain. For Steiner, it was important to realize that the thinking activity essentially is self-sustaining. If I say something is true, I have no other ground for basing it on as true except thinking itself. When I make a wrong thought, I can only correct it by another thinking. There is no outer reference point that can correct my thinking.
Somebody else could correct you.
Yes, and I could be shown that. Then I agree. and that happens all the time, then I agree my thinking has been wrong. But it's still my thinking that perceives what he's been saying that makes me make the correction.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to go into the example of the mirage as an example. It's very common. We are driving along the road and we see what looks like wet on the distant road, and we say, oh, it's raining, but it's reflecting. It's got a reflection in it, and we think, oh, why is that? But we find it's dry. And so it's often explained that it's our senses that have got wrong. We just haven't seen it correctly, but that's not the case. We actually have seen it, but our thinking has been misapplied because we haven't taken into account that several layers of different densities can bring this visible experience, this perception of what we call a wet road or a reflecting road. Yeah. So that was the thing that he had to strive to make clear. What is the nature of thinking? It's self-sustaining, but it has certain things. It doesn't just arise. We have to discipline it. We have to examine how it functions. We have to examine what other elements creep into it as we do the thinking. But thinking has many aspects to it. And one of the aspects is that people suddenly have an intuition, for example, and it seems to be very apt to the situation they're relating to. But that usually has some kind of prehistory, that you've been preoccupied with these kind of questions, like a doctor's preoccupied with certain questions, or a gardener, and so on. And then suddenly something comes up which seems to be a new insight into a situation. That's also thinking. It can be the very painstaking research of a scientist doing very complex work and so on also. So it has many forms, but it's essentially self-sustaining and is not dependent on a physiological situation. If you try to say that our thinking is guided or determined by physiology, then there is no freedom.
You mean the brain?
The brain, by brain processes, which is quite common today.
I mean, we can't think without a brain, but you're saying that it isn't necessarily the brain that's thinking.
Yes, I think I would put it like this, that through the body, and then especially the brain, we're able to express thinking, but it isn't the cause of thinking. Yeah. And one could go in more detail in this, but I think for the moment that's enough to say that it's important to realize that the human being has the potential to think on its own ground. It's not determined by something else, whether it's the brain, the physiology, or the genetic situation, or whatever.
So we're talking about something invisible, certainly.
Absolutely invisible, and the potential of every human being. Yeah. That is, you might say, one of the forces in the universe. We look at all the others, gravity and the electromagnetic forces, but this is also a force in the universe, the human capacity to think. But it's not determined by other grounds than its own ground.
Yeah. I mean, one of the stumbling blocks that people have, I think, understandably with Steiner, in terms of this knowing, is how, when he talks about, the evolution of the universe or the spirit, what he calls the spiritual world, how can somebody know that in that sort of detail?
Well, that's a question that one has to make up one's own mind about. The thinking that physics applies itself to are objects that you can usually perceive or sense in some way, like the air. And so we are very confident in the whole way we approach that things are caused by effects, have a cause, and so on. And the whole structure of modern physics is based on that kind of thinking. And now when you turn to other aspects which are not sensory objects, like feelings, in some way not really a sensory object, and certainly thoughts and ideas, then you ask yourself, well, what existence do these have? Are they purely subjective? They live in a kind of personal world, but they have no objectivity. Well, it doesn't seem to be clear, because our thoughts are the one things that we do share. Nobody who's really studied Pythagoras' theorem doubts it, or studies the effects of warmth on objects and so on, denies that. So that when we refer to our thinking, we realize we're dealing with something there that's beyond the personal. It's impersonal in a way. We do it, but we are reaching into an impersonal world, not a personal, staying in a personal world. My thoughts are just my own, and your thoughts are just your own. It's quite clear that we don't live like that. We live in a world in which we can share thoughts, because thoughts can reach an objectivity. That doesn't mean to say that all our thoughts are objective, of course, because we select them according to inclinations, according to our background, our education, and we make certain preferences and so on, which spoils our thinking. And we also make frameworks in which we're prepared to think. And Kant had a framework in which he was prepared to think, so that once he decided that the world is, out of his thinking, unknowable, then he gears his thinking in terms of that attitude. And similarly, at the same time, there were utilitarians who were talking about moral questions, and they were saying, well, the basis of morality is pleasure. So that's their framework. Everything that if I want to understand morality, I want to look at human beings seeking pleasure. So therefore, I look for a society which creates most pleasure for most people. That's a good society. They've made a framework. Steiner dispenses with all frameworks. He wants us simply to confront a phenomenon with this awakened thinking. I'd call it that, awakened thinking. Not just wanting to have a thought about it, but an awakened thinking. That is a kind of perception of the object you're looking at, whether it's feelings, somebody else's thoughts, or an object like a table, or an experience like warmth. That's it.
Yeah. But going back just for a moment to this, unknowable dimension of the universe, of the world that Kant speaks about. I mean, there are people who believe in God, in angels, but this, they feel, is not something that can be known as a fact. This is to do with faith. But now Steiner will speak about these realms as facts. He seems to speak out of a knowledge.
Yeah.
Now, what's going on there?
Yeah. In this book, The Philosophy of Reading, Steiner talks about the essential separation human beings grow to feel as they live their lives. We are separated from life. Life's going on somewhere and I'm here. And there's a kind of ditch between, And so Steiner says the striving of human beings is to overcome that kind of ditch, that abyss. And one of the ways is that we see things happening in the world and we try to understand them. Whatever's going on, I say, what causes it? So I engage my thinking in it. So that's one way of trying to cross the ditch. And once I understand something, I'm with it. But that's not the only way we cross the ditch. And he says the whole history of art is, in one way of looking at it is crossing the ditch. I'm using my own words. And that means that Van Gogh, for example, when he goes out in the field and looks at these sunflowers or whatever, he's wanting to be them, be it, not just be a camera looking at it, but be it. And so he paints in a way that for him is some kind of self-identification with the world out there. And similarly, if you read not what goes on in religious institutions necessarily, but you read of the experiences of people which can only be called a religious experience, you can't just dismiss that. That also, in Steiner's presentation in the philosophy, is another way of crossing a bridge. There's an experience of possibly exaltation, possibly, well, there are many ways in which this has been even studied, the meditation situations of mystics and so on. People see there are facts going on there which we don't fully understand. Now, Steiner puts all that within the realm of potential knowledge. Nothing is excluded. Whether what's happening in traditional religions, who are looking at a book and demanding that everybody sees as this is the final truth, that he's not concerned with. So then I can't go and tell you why Steiner decided to talk about the subjects of religion and so on, because from his point of view, he initiated these discussions or these presentations with inner experiences. And from his point of view, he's looking at these inner experiences as we look at any other inner experience and try to make it coherent and understandable. And so when you look at history, which was one of the studies of Steiner, and you look at how the Greeks thought and how the people in the Middle Ages thought and how people today think, then it's possible to trace in the examination of the facts presented what he calls an evolution in consciousness. And it seems to me that this is a crucial concept for today, because there are many tendencies to suddenly eliminate whole areas of consciousness which are not sympathetic to certain frameworks. You see, for example, people who are the secular humanists are not very interested in the Middle Ages because they had their focus on what we would call religious themes. But that was part of their consciousness, and if you eliminate that, you're eliminating something of the story. And the story is an evolution of consciousness, which is totally different from our ideas of progress.
John, there is this other strand to the book that you mentioned, morality.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say that ultimately the way we look at the world is interwoven with the way we see we should act in the world. They're not separate things. So what we've been talking about, epistemology, how do we understand the world, I don't say it directly affects it, but it has an influence into how we act in the world. And you can see moral questions are huge today. Not only are we facing tremendous questions about the environment and all that stuff, but also that people have such different notions of what's moral and what's right and what's not right and so on. And we're all living together and we've got to sort these problems out together. Now, Steiner, he doesn't attack conventional morality or anything like that, but he wants to show that the source of morality is in the activity of the activity of human beings. And essentially, moral development arises in individuals, not in groups. Although groups can share moral attitudes, that's no question about that, but the initiation of morality is always from some figures or individuals. In the past, there were these great figures like Moses and others, but today it's not like that. So it has to initiate out of individuals, and this is a huge burden on people today. How do we deal with people who are dying? How do we, all these questions, there are great divisions in society about the right way. Now, Steiner insisted that morality is essentially a human creation. It's basically that, a human creation. We can't derive our morality from any kind of metaphysical entity or from simply by looking at rules that were laid down in the past. So Steiner is quite clear about this. So although the New Testament may be a great guide, these things can't ultimately be authority in everything in modern life. The authority is the individual. Now, to get there, of course, to become an authority or feel oneself's got or any author's rights in that area, the one has to look at one's own egotism. And of course, we're full of egotism. So you have to see in what way can your thinking clarify your egotism for you, and enable you to overcome it. Because while you're still looking at social problems out of your own egotism, you're not likely to see them as they really are. And the other thing is, depends on just how wakeful one is, because often people talk about social problems and you think they're half asleep. So one has to be very awake when whatever one's confronting in life today, and that's especially, of course, in human relationship. That's where we are really geared in our moral life. And we don't always act with great awakefulness or be attentive to just how much egotism is playing into our actions. But for Steiner, it is possible for human beings, because human beings are beings that change, beings that transform, beings that grow.
Evolve.
Beings that evolve.
Yeah.
That's their essence, you might say. There isn't such thing as a human being who's just defined and static. And of course, as most people realize today, that human beings have to change. And that is a key element in Steiner's whole concept of the evolution of consciousness and the individual development, which he lays down many thoughts to help people to go along that path of inner development. So then if it's the case that morality is ultimately a creation of the human being, then we have to look at our social problems to say, and we say we really can't look for any outer reference point that's going to tell us what to do. And so these catastrophes that we create are human creations, and they impel us to look at why we act in such a way, and that these problems are really addressing us to wake us up in one way, to attend to why we act in certain ways. So that's quite crucial for Steiner.
But you're saying then that the source of morality is within the human being?
Yeah, that's what Steiner would insist on that.
Rather than some outer rules from what people call God, for example.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. There is no divine dictate for Steiner. And the human being, you see, from the Kantian perspective, the human being becomes isolated, and of course that in the 20th and 21st century, that feeling of isolation and meaninglessness of existence has become very large in our understanding of the world. And for Steiner, again, how we look at our thinking is the rescue point of that situation, that rescues it, because we then realize our contribution to how the world is. The world isn't just like that. We are contributing to how that world is created. So similarly, in the moral sphere, we are the masters of that destiny, and our immorality has its consequences, and our morality has its healing. And that's a human resource. And only when that human resource is taken note of can we actually move forward. And of course one sees many signs that people do move forward, but also many signs of the opposite, that people are still driven by sheer egotism and isolation and all sorts of things.
Yeah. John, can I ask you just lastly then, when Steiner wrote this book, Philosophy of Freedom, he wasn't really appreciated or even accepted in academic circles, was he? And in philosophical circles. I mean, why was that so?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I can fully answer that question. You have different streams of philosophy emerging out of Kant, and of course the Anglo-Saxon one tends to be more an empirical school. That is what life's more or less telling us how to think. In a way, we just look out at it and it tells us what our thinking should be, and of course we study it scientifically. And also the science becomes very dominant in our concept of what understanding the world is. Philosophy and theology get pushed aside. And now, even today, many people think that the only valid approach to understanding the world is the scientific one of looking at what the senses tell us and analyzing these in terms of whatever mathematics or the available instruments that we have. So from that point of view, all kind of philosophy has been somewhat marginalized. There's, of course, great philosophical thinking being going on in the 20th century, but it's often in either on the margins of science or in opposition to science, or trying to say we're looking at another area, a subjective area from the scientific point of view. And Steiner would reject that there are these divisions in our understanding of the world. He is what he called himself, a monist, and that means it's a one world, and it isn't, and we have to understand why it's one world. Now, materialists will say, of course it's one world, because it's all material, and only material forces and material events, and what you think are qualities and all that are in fact just subjective things. You like beauty, and somebody else has another idea of beauty. So that's also a subjective world. But the real world is the world of material and mechanical forces and events and so on. That's a monistic world. Well, Steiner said, okay, if that's how you look at it, fine. But my world is a real monistic world, because I don't exclude anything. The human being is a product of this world that and he is acting into it, and that's also part of my world. The scientist tends to put the scientist outside the world he's looking at. So that's a different meaning of the word monist. But Steiner really felt that he was trying to bring a unifying understanding of the human being in the world, and he felt this was health-giving. He said, read my book and it will give you a basis for meeting all the difficult problems that you meet in life. That's not what people are looking for in philosophy necessarily. It's comfort, it's consolation, it's something else. He's not offering that.
Because it's a difficult book, isn't it?
Yeah, people say it's very difficult, but there are other people who are far more difficult than Steiner. Kant is much more difficult, and Heidegger too. So, yeah. But it doesn't just, it's not just put on the table for you. You know, nothing real is just thrown on the table. You've got to work for it.